Welcome at the webinar in which Baruch Bush, one of the founders of Transformative Mediation, explains the Transformative Framework. This webinar was organized on November the 26th, 2020 by the Stichting Het Transformatieve Model, the Dutch liaison of the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. In this webinar, Baruch explains what transformative mediation is and why he started transformative mediation together with his co-founder Joseph Folger.
The first part I want to talk about is the transformative framework itself. So let me approach this from the standpoint in terms of talking about the framework itself, from the standpoint of talking about what, at least I think, is unique about it within the world of mediation and conflict intervention. And I would say that there are 3 points that sort of capture the uniqueness of the transformative framework. The first of them is goes to the goal of intervention. What's the goal of intervention? What's the goal of the transformative mediator? And how does it differ from the goal of a mediator using a different process, different approach to mediation? So the answer to that is that transformative mediation is not about achieving agreement, which is not to say that it wants to avoid reaching agreements, but that's not the point. The point is, it's not about agreement, it's about interaction. It's about helping the parties to establish a different kind of interaction than they have at the point where you meet them, at the point where their conflict stands right now. So our premise is, or our understanding, our premise, our model, our vision of what conflict is it's about changing the interaction between the parties to the conflict. And our assumption is that parties care about that. In fact, they care about it as much or more than they care about anything else, including reaching an agreement. That's a different focus from any other approach to mediation or conflict intervention. And that approach is captured by the picture that Anya is about to put up, hopefully, on the screen to replace my smiling face. So this picture, which serendipitously emerged in the middle of a training session one year, captures the concept of what's going on in conflict. That is what we are suggesting as a descriptive view of conflict in the transformative approach. There are many ways of describing what's going on in conflict. Most of them focus on the differences between the parties on issues and interests and positions, and they would represent the conflict in different ways on a piece of paper. This is the way we represent it because as we see conflict, it's about the interaction between the parties. And what is the nature of that interaction, that phenomenon? So if you look at the left side of this picture, it suggests that when parties start out realizing that they're in conflict with each other, that tends to have the effect of generating a sense of weakness, of self, confusion, unclarity, indecisiveness, inability to articulate what you think. When you first get into a conflict, that's what happens to you. It happens to you. You don't decide to be like this, but that's what happens. And as that happens, and that's what these lines go, these sort of half circles going up and down between weakness and below that self-absorption, there's a kind of vicious cycle that develops. The weaker I feel in myself, the more self-absorbed and hostile I become towards you. So this vicious cycle of weakness and self-absorption meaning what? Meaning consciousness of only myself, non-recognition of you, hostility to you, closedness, suspiciousness, all of these things are part of the lower left-hand side of that diagram. And when that cycle starts to twist and turn and feed back into each other, weakness producing more self-absorption, producing more weakness, and producing more self-absorption, the result is the overall interaction between the parties, which had started out as a normal human interaction, begins to go down like that arrow at the far left side of the picture. So the interaction between the parties becomes negative, destructive, alienating, and demonizing. Now, today, I don't have to look very far for an example of any of that, because all I have to do is to read the news in the United States. I don't know how it reads over there where you folks are, but over here, the last many, many months has been a perfect picture of weakness and self-absorption on all sides, leading to interaction between individuals and groups, both, which is negative, destructive, alienating, and ultimately demonizing. And we've seen plenty of demonization, and we're still seeing it. So that's a pretty nasty kind of conflict to be in. And it is something that happens very quickly. It can happen on a subway platform when people bump into each other. It can happen on a listserv on the internet when people make comments that other people don't like. It's a very fast-moving, degenerative phenomenon. And we would call this arrow going down, we would call that interactional degeneration. Some people would call it conflict escalation. It's the same thing, just looked at from a different point of view, instead of up, down, down, up. That's our picture of what happens in conflict, not because people are bad or mean or inherently selfish or stupid, but because that's the dynamic of the effect that conflict has on regular human beings. It's not pathological, it's normal, but it's also very ugly. So on the other hand, we also believe, this is our picture, this is our descriptive picture. There is, by the way, lots of research to support this descriptive picture of conflict interaction, both the negative side, but I'm about to get to the positive side. The positive side happens because as human beings, we're very resilient. And therefore, even though we may quickly accelerate into this weakness and self-absorption and negative conflict, we tend to bounce back, just like we bounce back from the flu, or we bounce back from a cold. We bounce back from conflict, negative conflict, and we find ourselves regaining our sense of strength on the one hand. So we get clearer about what we believe and want to say. We get calmer, we get more decisive, we get more articulate. All of this happens by itself. There's no need for an intervener for this to happen. And we don't have enough interveners for this to happen in all the cases we have a conflict. So in other words, parties regain their sense of strength of self. And as they do so, they begin to become more responsive and open to each other. The stronger I get, the stronger I feel, the less threatened I am by you, and the more open I am to you. And therefore, there is a feedback loop on this side also between strength and responsiveness. That would be a virtuous loop, not a vicious cycle, but a virtuous cycle, which begins to kick in out of our normal human resiliency and decency. And the result of it is, even without any intervention, and that's the dotted line going across the bottom of the page and up to the top, that the interaction between parties to conflict regenerates itself into a kind of positive, constructive, connecting, and humanizing interaction, even when we've achieved no agreement at all. So we can still be in conflict, but our conflict is a positive and constructive conflict, not a negative and destructive conflict. Now that's our descriptive picture of what happens, what actually happens in conflict. Now, this is our picture. This is where we start with the transformative theory of conflict and intervention from this picture. And the truth of the matter is other people have different pictures. That's fine. This is ours to explain what is going on in conflict. And I'm pretty sure it's a unique picture. Very little in terms of a conflict resolution literature focuses on interaction rather than transaction. Most of the conflict intervention literature is about transactional moves by the parties, whether or not supported by interveners. But it's transactional. It's about stuff and making agreements and shifting things around in order to meet the needs and interests of everybody involved, if you can, getting to yes and so on. But it's not about interaction unless you sort of make interaction part of the needs and interests. But we're not going to do that. We're saying this is like a category by itself. And this is what people care about. When people get involved in conflict, what bothers them is not that they're not getting some interest met. It's that they're beginning to act in ways that they find repellent to themselves, towards their own self and towards each other. And they don't want to behave that way. So they want to change the way that they behave and are interacting with one another. That's our view of what conflict is about. Now, so that's number one. That particular what conflict represents to parties. We think that this is what people think, not what we think as interveners. We believe, based on quite a bit of research, that this is what matters to people. This is what's really bothering them in conflict. And therefore, they want to do something about it. They want to basically get out of the lower left-hand corner. They want to get out of negative interaction, and they're stuck in it because people do get stuck. The vast majority of the time, people make this shift from negative back to positive conflict by themselves. If they didn't, we'd have a far higher murder rate. We'd have an infinitely higher divorce rate. We'd have all kinds of horrible social consequences. But people bounce back by themselves. But sometimes they don't. And when they don't, and they get stuck in the destructive, negative, demonic cycle, that's really horrible for everybody and for everybody around the parties to conflict. So that's when an intervener is needed. That leads us to step two, to point two, about the transformative view. And I may not connect this instantly, but I'll try to do it eventually. And that is that the only thing that enables people to move out of negative destructive conflict and towards positive conflict, the only thing that helps to do that are things that they do for themselves. No one can do that for parties to conflict. You can't get people to be stronger. You can't get people to be more understanding or responsive to each other. You can't get people to do any of those things. Lots of times my students, my people that I talk to are talking, well, how do I get the parties to XYZ? As soon as I hear that word get, how do I get the parties? I know that they're on the wrong track, because you can't get people to do these things. What you can do is you can support parties' decisions to do things for themselves. And that's where the second unique point comes in about the transformative model, and that is the idea of self-determination. Now you would say, well, what is unique about that? Come on, everybody knows mediation is all about self-determination. It always has been from the earliest, glimmerings of the modern mediation field in the 60s and the 70s, and I was there at that time. Everybody talks about self-determination is the core value of the process. It's what the process is all about. Everyone agrees on that. So what I would say about that is that is terrific rhetoric. It's terrific language, but it has very, very little to do with what actually happens on the part of mediators and interveners in the mediation process, which is to say that overwhelmingly, the research tells us that mediators are not supportive of party self-determination, of party decision-making. Overwhelmingly, mediators are, our word for it is, highly directive. They control things, they manage things, hence terms like conflict management. They decide what should happen in the process, and they persuade the parties to go along with what they want. And sometimes they persuade nicely, and sometimes they persuade not so nicely, but by the exercise of various kinds of manipulations and even pressure. So for us, the unique thing about transformative mediation is we take self-determination seriously. I think I even wrote an article called Taking Self-Determination Seriously, meaning that for us, there is no such thing as mediation unless the parties are making the decisions. For us, mediation is a party-driven, party-centered process, always. So one of our premises is that mediators, this is one of our, we could call it a slogan, but I like slogans. The slogan is that as a mediator, I support and never supplant party decision-making. That's what I do. About everything, at every stage of the process. I am never going to step in and take over a decision from the parties themselves, whatever it's about process, about outcome, about the order of discussion, about the language being used, about the issues to be discussed, about the solutions to be considered. Nothing. It's not any of it my business, And my decision, it's the decision of the parties. And my role there is to support them in making their own decisions about all of these things in the process. That's all I do. It doesn't mean I don't do anything. Doesn't mean I don't do anything. In fact, there's a lot of activity on my part. Anyone who has read our book on mediation, The Promise of Mediation, and the transcript of something called the Purple House Mediation in that book will know that mediators in the transformative approach do a lot of things. They don't just sit there like quote unquote potted plants. But everything that they do is justified as a way of supporting party decision making, including decisions parties make about how to see each other, which is part of self-determination, although it goes to the second wing of what we talk about, which is inter-party recognition, the way parties see each other. So this is the second major innovation, I think. It's not really, you can't consider it an innovation because everybody always believed in the centrality of self-determination. It's just that they didn't take it seriously, right? So they would say, well, yeah, I support self-determination as long as it works, quote unquote, as long as it works. So our question is, works to do what? And usually the answer to that question is works to get parties closer to an agreement. And when that process is stalling, when the parties are not moving, when we reach an impasse, then I, have to become a little more directive. I have to do a little bit of supplanting. My students always ask me this. When can we do a little bit of supplanting? And my answer is never, 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 never. Then you're not a transformative mediator anymore. And that's unique. Everybody else thinks that there is a point at which you can and often have to step in and do a little bit of supplanting party decision making with your own ideas and persuasive efforts and so on. And our view is that you're never going to do that. And this connects with the first thing, with the overall picture. So why do we say where's the mediator in this picture? The answer is the mediator is at the very bottom of the picture, underneath those two bridges that go across that we call empowerment and recognition. These are shifts that the parties themselves make based on their own choices and that help them to shift from weakness to strength and from self-absorption to responsiveness or connection with each other. The mediator doesn't stand behind the parties pushing them across those bridges and doesn't stand in front of the parties pulling them across those bridges. The mediator stands right underneath the bridges, supporting the actions that the parties take to walk, run, or jump across those bridges. That's my role as a mediator, to support and never supplant party self-determination and decision-making and inter-party perspective taking and recognition. And the reason it has to be that way, the reason, in other words, my commitment to self-determination is so strong, is that if I should violate that principle of self-determination, if you imagine that parties are beginning to move across the top bridge to gain a sense of their own capacity and strength, and I step in either to tell them to change their language, to talk about a different issue, not to become so emotional, whatever it is that I tell them, as soon as I tell them anything, what it does is it drives them back towards the left, back across that bridge. It tells them, you know what, you're not as strong as you think, you're not as competent as you think, you're not as wise as you think, really, you're pretty weak and pitiful. Let me do this, and you just follow my lead. That's what my intervention, when it supplants their decision making, that's what it does. It disempowers them. It delegitimates them. One could say it infantilizes them. It does anything but help them to move from weakness to strength. Therefore, my commitment to self-determination has to be so strong because without it, there's no such thing as conflict transformation. The top bridge is the one that drives everything else in this picture. As parties gain strength, they almost automatically tend to open up to each other. So the top bridge or arrow leads to the bottom one. And the two of them together lead to the overall movement, from negative and destructive conflict to positive and constructive conflict. And if I don't support party decision making, if I don't support practically self-determination, then I never let the process get started. Or if it does get started, I interrupt it and drive it backwards. And that's the explanation for why my commitment to self-determination is so strong. And again, I think this is a second piece of what's unique about our work. I don't know any other approach to conflict that puts the emphasis that we do on party self-determination and decision-making and means it. I know a lot of others that say they do it, but I don't know anybody else that actually does it. And I've looked hard because I would love to have allies, but I haven't found them. Mostly mediators retreat either very quickly or later on to some form of supplanting of party decision-making in the name of achieving some other goal other than conflict transformation. Maybe it's repairing a relationship in family mediation. Maybe it's achieving a deal in business mediation. Maybe it's avoiding a riot in community mediation. There's always some other thing on the table that justifies limiting or eliminating party self-determination. For us, there's nothing that justifies limiting or eliminating party self-determination. Now that leads to point 3. And point number 3 is that all the way along here, I hope that you have heard me using theory to explain practice. That there's an underlying theory of what's happening in conflict, number 1. What parties want in conflict, number 2. And these are theoretical constructs. These are ideas about conflict, what it represents as a social phenomenon, what's going on, in other words, and what parties want when they're in that situation. And that theoretical picture is what drives my actual concrete intervention practices. So for example, a key part of this theory is, which we'll maybe talk about more in the second part, why do I think parties care so much about conflict transformation, about changing the quality of their interaction? Why do I think that they care as much or more about that than they do about getting a good outcome, a good resolution, whatever it means to them? Why would I think such a thing? That's a theoretical question. I have to have some theoretical basis for answering that question. And that theoretical basis has to include some view of human nature, of human capacity, of human motivation. If I don't have such a theory, then I don't really have a very good reason to think that this is what matters to people. And it matters so much that I should avoid ever doing anything that supplants their decision-making. It must be something that is more important than salvaging a relationship, more important than keeping a family together, more important than maximizing commercial value, or as the Harvard folks would have, not leaving value on the table, more important than stopping wars, more important than making peace. What is that? And why would I think that parties value it so much? That's called theory. If you don't have a theory to explain that, then you can't really justify a lot of what you're doing as a mediator. We have a theory, and therefore we talk about 3 levels, and we teach at 3 levels. We talk about practice, purpose, and premises. And we say that premises, beliefs, ideology, worldview, that drives how we define our purpose, our goals. That explains why we think one goal matters more than others. And the goal, the purpose of our work, is what drives the practice. So premises drive purpose, drive practice. Or to put it differently, the why behind what I'm doing defines the what that I'm doing, and that defines the how I'm doing it. The how comes from the what, and the what comes from the why. And all of that is something that we can explain, and we do explain, and interconnect in our work. That's what it means to have a coherent theory behind your practice. That's another, I believe, element in our approach, which is unique in the conflict in the conflict intervention world. There are other approaches, many of them, to conflict interaction, other theories of mediation, whether it's needs and interest theory, whether it is family systems theory, whatever it is. But I have not found that many, if any, of these other approaches take seriously the need to explain at a theoretical level why they're doing what they're doing and why they think it has value. It's assumed that it has value. What are you talking about? Helping people to reach an agreement? Who could disagree that that has value? Well, a lot of times, you know what? People reaching agreement is something that people actually don't want. Joe Folger went to a conference in Europe. I think it was in Germany, not the Netherlands, where after a while, one of the participants on a panel got up and said, you know, all you conflict resolution people, all you want to do is peace, 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 and you don't care a thing about justice. I don't give a damn about your peace. My folks care about justice. Oh, that's interesting. And if that's the case, where does justice fit into these theories of settlement-oriented mediation? How does that take account of justice? The answer is it doesn't. Despite some efforts, not too many, to explain how it might. But essentially, the assumption is we don't need to explain what we do. This is basically part of the theory of ideology. Dominant ideologies never have to explain what they do. Why should we explain it? A fish doesn't know he's living in water. Participants in the dominant ideology don't know that they're participating in an ideology. So actually, it's helpful to be an outsider, which we're like outsiders in this picture, because outsiders do have to explain themselves. So this is the third leg of the uniqueness of the transformative model is we explain ourselves. We have always tried to root our statements of what we do, how we practice as mediators, with our definition of our goal as interveners, and we've always tried to explain that with our explanation of our underlying values, our ideology that drives all the rest of it. So there are three, I think that's three, right? There are three things that I think are quite unique about the transformative approach and that I think are quite important. Why would you want to be doing something that you don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing? And you actually may not even understand what you're doing. The dominant metaphor for lots of mediation and mediators is the toolbox metaphor, right? I have a toolbox and I just take out whatever tool is required in whatever situation I'm in and I use the tool. And my question always to my students is, you use it to do what? What are you using this tool for? In other words, what's your goal? And why do you think that's an important goal? Why do you think it matters to the people that you're serving, if you think you're serving them? How do you get a practice out of a toolbox? A practice out of a toolbox is a contradiction in terms. Maybe it works, I don't mean to denigrate anybody, to sell shoes. I grew up selling shoes. That was my father's business. We didn't have to have a theory. We just had to go out there and sell shoes and find the right size and put them on. You can't do that as a mediator. You can, and lots do, but that's not what we do. So those are the three sort of defining, I think, and particularizing elements of the transformative approach to mediation.
This is the end of part 1 of the webinar. We will go on with part 2, in which Baruch will answer questions from participants.